I am Diane Lucas and welcome to Book 101. Book 101 is all about the books that I read for the last 40 years. And today I have my special guest. He is my always avid guest on Book 101 review. Now we're doing a video podcast. No other than Mr. Richard Ayre.
Yeah, Daniel, how are you doing?
I'm fabulous, fabulous like you, mister. And can you please introduce yourself?
Right. Well, I've written a few books. I started with the very book we're going to talk about today, Minstrel's Bargain. Uh, Wrote that quite a while ago, and I've written two sequels to that book to turn it into a trilogy. And I've also written again a sort of a horror science fiction type book called Point of Contact. And a speculative sort of book called A Life Eternal. And the last book that I had published was a couple of years ago now, and that was a historical crime thriller called Shadow of the Night.
So, Mr. Richard, what is the central prophecy that drives the plot of the prophecy trilogy?
Right. Well, it's the prophecy trilogy. It doesn't really appear in the first book. Minstrel's Bargain is the first book, and then you've got Minstrel's Renaissance, and finally Minstrel's Requiem. The prophecy is these books. These three books sort of encompass different worlds, if you like. What I suppose you might call heaven and hell, as well as where we all live at the moment. And the prophecy is a story that has been around, certainly in heaven and hell, although they're not called really heaven and hell in the books. You can think of them, it's a bit easier to think of them like that. And it is a prophecy that will bring about huge changes to all three of those worlds. And as the books go on, as the three books go on, we see that prophecy beginning to unfold.
Yes. So, what is the main protagonist of the series and what is their role in the prophecy?
There are two main characters, I suppose. The first one being the minstrel, the demon whose job it is to recruit souls. Recruit is the wrong word. Steal souls is probably a much better word to use. But the main character, the hero of these three books, if you like, is a guy called Phil Sturgess, who, when we first meet him in Minstrel's Bargain, Phil is a 29, just coming up for 30-year-old. He's a young man, and he's loving life. He's a reporter for a rock music magazine, because the first book is set in 1988. It goes into 1989, so it's set, what's that, 30 years ago now, more. And he is the main character, but as the book, certainly as Minstrel's Bargain progresses and as the other books come about, he realizes he has a much bigger role to play than just interviewing music stars. He's central to this prophecy that begins to unfold around him, and he really doesn't want anything to do with it. He's terrified a lot of the time, because what he starts to witness and what he starts to come across is obviously so far beyond his or anybody's really what they've come across before. And so yeah, I tried to make Phil as grounded and as realistic as I could. But yeah, Phil is the main protagonist, and Minstrel is if you want to call him, the baddie of the books.
How does the prophecy impact the lives of the characters in the trilogy?
Well, certainly the impact on Phil's life massively. Uh, there are some personal tragedies that he goes through um, because of his connection, because of his how he is a central part of this. He feels, and I try to portray him as really a cog. He's like he's like a spider caught under a lawnmower. He tries his best to not be part of this horrible world that he's thrust into, but he realizes, certainly across the three books, he realizes that he has no chance, and he never actually had any choice at all. Uh, he has to do what he has to do, and so it has a massive impact on him, and later on his family as well.
Yes. So, what are the key locations where the story take place, and how they influence the narrative?
The key for certainly in all three, but certainly in the first book, it's set in it's not my hometown, but the nearest big city to where I live, which is Newcastle upon Tyne in the northeast of England. Obviously, it's a northern town. Um, there is a grittiness to it, especially in the 1980s. It's a lot fancier now than it used to be in the 1980s. And the language, the banter, if you like, certainly between Phil and his best friend, a guy called Toby. There's a lot of sort of silly banter between the two of them, which is something I wanted to have in this book. It is they're pretty grim, and they're quite full on bloodthirsty. But I tried to bring going back to what I was saying before about having Phil Sturgess as quite a realistic type person. If you were a real person thrust into this horror world, what would you be like? And that was always, I always try to keep that central to the storytelling. And so the city of Newcastle, if you are from England, you will know that Newcastle has it's a bit of a reputation as a party town. You know, there's a lot of stag do's and hen nights and things happen in Newcastle city centre. Um, but it is a wonderful place, and I wanted to. I think I think writing about people like me, you know, because Phil Sturgess is very much like me. I think as one of my early protagonists that I wrote about. Since I've written that, I've written about people who are very different to me on purpose. But I think there's with this book, with Minstrel's Bargain, there is a sort of a rawness and a bit of a what's the word? I'm trying to think of the word that I'm looking for. There's I hadn't. This was the first sort of book I had published, and so I basically just wrote what I wanted to write and what I would like to read, and that was about a man, a bloke, an ordinary bloke, caught up in horrific circumstances, but at the same time, it's in my hometown of Newcastle, which gives it that, I think, for me, a realistic aspect that if I'd set it at the time, if I'd set it in, say, London or Toronto or you know, wherever, it wouldn't have been as realistic because I don't know those places like I know Newcastle. I think there is something about being able to describe alleyways and little snippets and um, you know, things like there's a scene in Minstrel's Bargain where there's a at the castle keep, which is an ancient castle keep. It's from the sort of 13th century. This old castle, and I love the castle keep, and I go there a lot. So I knew how to describe somebody trying to get away from somebody who's trying to murder them in this, what is, if you look at it, quite a spooky scary place anyway, because it's an old castle. So things like that, I think, helped. And I think Newcastle is definitely stamped, especially in the Minstrel's Bargain. There are, as the books go on, we'll sort of move away slightly from that. It becomes a bit more worldwide rather than just focused in on Newcastle. But yeah, I think writing about places you know about certainly helped. It helped me with this first attempt at writing that I gave.
Yes, very well said, Mr. Richard. So, how do you use symbolisms throughout the
Oh
trilogy?
my goodness, symbolism. How do I use symbolism? That's a question, Daniel. I don't even know if I, at the time, recognised that. I just, as I've written more books and as I've got better, I have to say, you get better the more you write. It's like anything, driving a car. You don't just get into a car and drive and you're a great driver. You have to learn. You have to learn how to do things. And I think, in a lot of ways, Minstrel's Bargain, when it was first published, it was probably published too early. It could have done with a massive amount of editing and changing, if not changing things really, but just making things a little bit more professional. I would say would be how I would use that. But I didn't recognise that at the time because I just wanted to read the story that I had in my head for years and years, and I wanted to put that story out, which I eventually did. And so I don't think the symbolism, I suppose there are symbols, but it's this idea of likening music to the human soul. This is what Minstrel does. He is a musician, and his music plays out the last few bars of people's lives, if you like, and steals their immortal souls. So that there is definitely symbolism about music, but I don't think there is. I can't. It's a long time since I've read any of the Minstrel books, to be honest with you. Symbolism, I suppose. There's always the in itself, it is an old-fashioned premise. It's good versus evil. It's the unwilling hero being thrust into a situation and having to deal with it and having to best this creature against all the odds. So that there's nothing groundbreaking about the actual idea of the story. The structure is probably slightly different to other books in that way, but in a way, without trying to blow my own trumpet or anything like that, it's Star Wars. It's black and white cowboy films. It's the old idea of a man having to. It's high noon. It's Gary Cooper in High Noon. Nobody's going to help him, and he has to be a man, and he has to do the right thing. And that's what Phil has to do in these books. He has to do the right thing. He doesn't want to, and he wishes to God somebody else was there to do it. But he realizes and he recognizes that he is a pawn, he is a cog. And you find this out much later in the third book. He's just a cog in a game. He's a pawn in a game played by creatures much higher than he is, And I suppose that symbolism, if there is anything of that part of the story, is about life itself. We all think our lives are important, and everybody's life is important. But in the grand scheme of things, most people, I'm speaking as a sort of a history teacher here, but most people just pass through history and don't really get remembered apart from their families. And when the families die, their memories die as well. And you think of all the billions of people who have passed through history, and we only really remember either the extremely bad or the extremely successful, I should think. I don't think there's anybody ever been extremely good. But you remember the Hitlers, and you remember the Napoleons, and you remember the Nelsons, and so yeah, I thinking about it when you've thrown that question at me. I suppose there is quite a lot of symbolism in there, and it all leads down to life. And I think, to be honest, with a lot of my writing, uh, that's that's what I write about. In a funny sort of way, I sort of write about what's going on and how things in your life impact on your life.
Very well done, Mr. Richard. But before we go on, I want to shout out our listeners in New Zealand. Thank you, New Zealand, for supporting this podcast because in Auckland, I get 44% audience share. Wellington, Canterbury, Nelson, Bay of Plenty, Waikato, Taranaki, and Southland. Again, thank you so much, New Zealand, for supporting this podcast because this podcast is created to empower writers, authors all over the world like Mr. Richard Ayre. What are the main themes explored in Prophecy Trilogy, Mr. Richard?
The themes are what I've just been told about. Really, it's about life and death and the afterlife. Because in these books, if you agree with the afterlife or not, it doesn't really matter. In these books, they are real, and it's about redemption. Redemption is a massive theme, and you don't realize. And when I was writing these, I didn't realize that I was actually writing about redemption in a weird sort of way. But it's also about, like I said, doing the right thing, standing up for good, standing up for things that people need to stand up for, and being brave when it's very hard to be brave. And I think if there's anything, that is what this book is all about. It's about all of my stories, really. When I was younger, I used to read books. I used to read, pulp horror books by all sorts of different people. But James Herbert was certainly one of my favourites. And people have said my early books, like Minstrel's Bargain, like Point of Contact, are very Herbert-esque in the way they're written. But there was something I really liked about James Herbert. And the thing that I really liked about James Herbert's books is it was all an ordinary Joe, an ordinary man. In The Rats, the main character, the main protagonist, he's a teacher. He's an art teacher. He's just an ordinary man thrown into this hideous world. And for most of James Herbert's books, they're just ordinary people. The books that I'd read before that, they were always sort of, cops or ex-SAS soldiers or something like that. And I just thought, well, even in a paranormal situation, if that's what it was, those people are going to be better and more prepared than an ordinary person who works in a factory or whatever, And that's what I wanted to bring to the prophecy books. I wanted to have the ordinariness up against the sort of cosmic horror and pulp horror that the book deals with. And I think, that is my favourite part of those books. And having the trilogy, having the 3 books was really satisfying to get to the end of, to have 3 books all to do with one story. Because usually books, sequels, you'd have a different protagonist, and things might be different. But this is basically the same key people or creatures all the way through.
Definitely.
And it's just that having that ordinariness was really what I liked about those books.
How do the characters' personal journeys align with the overarching prophecy?
Well, I don't want to give too much away because if people do want to read them, but the in the first book we have Sturgess, and the other main character who we haven't talked about, of course, is a guy who was simply known as the Tramp. He's just an old homeless person that Sturgess, before the horror starts to unfold, he notices this old man sort of following him around all the time. And the Tramp has a lot to do with it. The Tramp is the teacher figure, going back to that idea of the being the one and having to compete and having to complete a task. There's always somebody there as a teacher. Star Wars, you had Obi-Wan Kenobi. And so you can argue that the Tramp is the Obi-Wan Kenobi type character in these books.
What ways the prophecy shape the political landscape of the trilogy world?
Yes. So getting back to the Tramp. So what we have is the Tramp, who is himself just a cog in a wheel. He's been given a task. His task is to ensure Sturgess stops Minstrel. Now, I'm not going to say whether he succeeds or not, because in the second book we have, and that book is set 10 years later. So we have the Tramp and Sturgess reunited in the second book to again get together. But this is where the prophecy begins to take shape. And the prophecy is this story of a human being who will be born that will get rid of evil. They'll destroy evil completely. Not completely, but destroy the sort of concept of what in the Christian world, I suppose you would call the devil. And of course, the devil isn't very happy about this, so the devil has to stop the prophecy. The Tramp and Sturgess end up as the protectors of this. But that link moves all the way through, from Sturgess being quite a bit useless, to be honest, in the first book, until you get towards the end when he realizes what he has to do. But the link goes through until at the end it's actually Sturgess who is the leader, and the Tramp is having to do what Sturgess says by this point. So there is this thread. I wouldn't say it's a political thing, but it's certainly, there's a thread of a change, going from Minstrel's Bargain to Minstrel's Requiem, of massive change for all of the three major characters, being Sturgess, the Tramp, and Minstrel himself. They all go through changes, and they're all trying to just survive, which is what I suppose the book is all about. They're all just trying to survive in their own little ways,
Yes, survival.
Yeah.
So, Mr. Richard, how did you develop the magical system within the trilogy?
Hey, God, I really don't know. My books usually start with the conclusion. Not always, but they usually start with me thinking, well, there's an ending to something. How are we going to get there? How do we end up with this conclusion? Sometimes that's even sometimes a dream. I'll have a dream and I'll wake up and think, oh, that's weird. Right, I'll write that down. And that could be the ending of a story. That could be the end of a book. But I need to know how on earth am I going to get to this ending? And so I began with this ending of at the beginning it was going to be a young boy. It turned into a man, a grown man, defeating an ancient evil. That was the whole thing. And then I wrote Minstrel's Bargain, and that was going to be the end of it, because I wrote this book way back in the early 1990s originally. And then it wasn't until about 2015 that I found a publisher for it. I'd left it for years and years and years. I hadn't done anything with it. But then I found a publisher, and they took it on. And so as I sort of rewrote parts of it because it had been originally written on a typewriter. It was, pages of stuff with Tipex on it. So I had to redo it onto the computer, so to be able to email it across. But as I was doing that, I added a chapter. So I wrote another chapter, the final chapter in 2015. And it had, because that one was set in 1989 at the end of the book, I thought, I'm going to set this. And I had no idea what I was going to do with this. I just thought it would make a spooky ending for the first book. So I had Sturgess 30 years older. It was his 60th birthday. So he's getting on a bit, and there's a bit of an ending to that. And then I thought, you know what? That could be I could write another story set 30 years after. But then I thought, well, actually, I could do something set in between. And it becomes easier because of something that happens to Sturgess after every adventure, after every book. But I'm not going to say what it is, because it would sort of spoil a little bit of it. But yeah, it just became this. It grew out of one book. I had no intention of writing any sequels to it, and it just grew out of that, of getting it published. And then I thought, well, I'll see if I can do something else. So actually, Minstrel's Renaissance was, even though after Minstrel's Bargain, I also got Point of Contact published, but that's a book I'd written years ago. It predated Minstrel's Bargain, actually. Probably wrote that in the late 80s. So Minstrel's Renaissance was the first book I'd sat in 2016 where I was writing a completely new book, because the other two had been written previously and changed and things. But yeah, it's weird how things work out
So, Mr.
over these
Richard,
three books.
yes, so Mr. Richard, how does prophecy evolve over the course of the 3 books?
Well, I can't really tell you because it would give the game away. But it evolves as this person who is the prophecy grows older. And there is the sort of the I don't know. I never call them the devil or God in the books, but there is a being who wants to stop the beast, as I call it, and there is the beast who wants to stop this higher level being. They're both female as well, actually. I made them both female, these strange creatures. And so it develops as Minstrel. God, it's really complicated. Minstrel in the first book is doing what the beast tells him to do. He is a soul taker, and he's playing out souls, and that's what he does. He's being his own boss. He works for the devil. By the time you get to the second book, Minstrel is doing the same thing, but he is beginning to walk a bit of a knife edge. He's trying to maybe set things up better for himself. And by the time you get to the third book, he is alone. The beast is after him. The light. I usually call it the darkness and the light, or the dark and the light. They're both after him. And at the same time, he is trying to get his hands on the prophecy, because that will make him untouchable. And so you have a change of what's going on in Minstrel's mind. But you've also got this prophecy unfolding through the music of this happens to be a girl whose music is the opposite to Minstrel's. Her music heals. Her music makes things better, whereas Minstrel's music creates havoc and heartache and horror. And that's how the prophecy sort of unfolds right across the three books. But I can't really tell you too much because it's sort of, it's like spoilers, you know.
Yes. Interesting trilogy, Mr. Richard. But before we go, and I'm inviting you to listen to my other podcast, Food 101, our fourth season, with Chef Alessandro, one of the executive chef in one of the five-star hotel in downtown Toronto. So please do listen to our latest episode. We talk about our Food 101 Culinary Course Volume 2, people. So please do purchase our Food 101 culinary course because it will help you to create a delicious food. So, Mr. Richard, what does the trilogy explore the concept of destiny versus free will?
I think, yeah, there is quite a bit of destiny versus free will in this, and I think Sturgess realizes that he has free will, but there are other creatures playing him a bit like a puppet. They're pulling his strings, and he doesn't even know it. So there is, and what at the end of the third book as well, there is a strong sense of destiny is being fulfilled. And I'm not a great believer myself in destiny. I think, you know, things just happen randomly. But then I'm not a very spiritual person, to be honest. But I do like reading about things like that, and I do like asking questions about that. But I would say definitely in these books, and it's not that I particularly believe in it, but I think it is destiny. The destiny has the upper hand over any free will that's going on.
Very well said, Mr. Richard, and looking forward for our next episode. Let's talk about the book 2 or book 3 of your prophecy trilogy. So,
Okay.
Mr. Richard, can you please invite our listeners to support all your books?
Yes, please. I mean, the books are all, if you want to, Amazon is obviously the best place to go. There's not just horror. There is, as I've said, there's a bit of historic crime. There's what I class as my probably best written book, which is called A Life Eternal, which asks a lot of questions which we were talking about life, about destiny, things like that, and in a lot deeper way. So yes, please, if you want to, please go to Amazon and have a look at the books, and if any of them tickle your fancy, you can download them. They're not that expensive, to be honest, for the Kindle versions, and I would be forever in your debt if you gave it a go.
Yes, let's support Mr. Richard Ayre because if you support him, more books to come. So, Mr. Richard, thank you for your time.
Well, thank you very much, Daniel.
More to come, people. See you soon.